Hey friends, it's Vasily. I want to be a better writer, and maybe you do too. Here's a list of tips. So if you clicked on this video, you're probably a little bit like me. You enjoy writing and you want to do more of it. Maybe you have a script idea, or you want to write short stories or poetry, or maybe even just journaling. Whatever the reason might be, writing is a super accessible way to express yourself creatively. I want to write a few short stories, maybe a novel, some scripts, a second poetry book, anything really. I just really enjoy writing. Sometimes I feel like certain things get in the way of it. So in this video, I'm going to go over some of the roadblocks that people like us face when we actually try to sit down and write. Before we get into the ways to get over the roadblocks, just do me a favor, hit that like button, show me that we're friends. A big problem that a lot of writers have when they first start out is trying to find the time to write. I used to write really casually, and at some point I put my poems together in a book and I thought, wow, this is really cool. But going forward, I didn't really have a plan for structuring my writing, so all my other work just kind of fell into the void. And I realized that if I wanted to be a better writer and actually finish the ideas in my head, I'm gonna have to put it into my routine. I'm gonna have to find a way to do a little bit of writing every single day. Now, a lot of people recommend writing first thing in the morning or right before bed because that's when you're most creative. And honestly, that's up to you. And for a lot of people who have to wake up in the morning and go to work, you might not want to feel rushed when you're writing. And that's fine. I actually really like the idea of writing right before bed, and I do think that's a nice way to wind down, get rid of your electronics, put everything away, just sitting down with a nice pad of paper and your favorite pen, and just letting go of any thoughts you have. It's also a really great idea to keep a notebook with you at all times, or at least having a section on your phone in your notes for writing, where you just write down quick thoughts that come into your head so that you have something to work on later when you do have a better chunk of time. A lot of people, when they first get serious about writing, want to know how often or how much they should be writing. The reality is that there's no amount, but the frequency is the most important. Writing every day is going to be way more beneficial than writing for 3 hours one day a week. You want to keep the ideas in your mind fresh and constantly flowing, and waiting for them all to pile up is not necessarily the best thing. If you want to get serious about your writing and you want to write more, you do have to start thinking about writing as an exercise. And just like exercise, you have to build it into a routine. It's got to be something you do on a regular basis. So if you're just getting into writing and you're having a hard time figuring out how much to write and when, I'm going to recommend to you 5 nights a week for 15 minutes. If you're new to building routines for yourself and you're not quite sure how to add in writing into that routine, I made this one video about motivation and triggers that's really helpful. So check it out somewhere up here. So let me share with you my trigger for writing. Every day after I finish my morning routines, I go downstairs and I sit at my dining room table with my laptop and some coffee. I set a 25-minute timer on my phone, and I don't move from that seat until that 25-minute timer is done. And then there's a 5-minute break, and if I've been really flowing and I have a good idea, then I'll sit down for another 25 minutes and keep writing. And if I haven't, then that's it. 25 minutes is all it takes. It doesn't really matter how much or how little I ended up writing, or even if it's any good. The point is that I set aside the time to write, and I did it. And just like working out or doing any other part of your routine, showing up is half the battle. Even if you have a few bad days of writing, or nothing comes out, and you end up with blank pages, sitting down and setting that time aside, whether it be 10 minutes or 1 hour, is going to help you. Okay, so you got your routine down and you have this great idea. And when you sit down to write, nothing comes out.
Fuck it! The night was humid. That's it, and that's all. Ugh.
This is a huge problem with a lot of writers, myself included. I've had this problem with anything from emails and essays to poetry and even the book I'm writing. And this all stems from a little thing called, when there's an idea that lives in your head for a story or anything, the idea is perfect. But as soon as you try to write it down, you can't because of a fear that it will never be as good as what you imagined. You kind of feel like you just don't know how to express it the same way that you feel it. And that's honestly because it's just easy to forget that we don't think in just words. When you imagine your story, when you imagine your poem or whatever you're writing, you can imagine the feeling, the sensation, the atmosphere. You can imagine all these things that you can't translate to words, but you think it's just words. So when you stare at a blank page and you're wondering why these great ideas don't come out, it's not because you're a bad writer. It's because you didn't realize that you're trying to translate a feeling into text. And you want to do that on the first try.
You are so dumb. You are really dumb.
So what I do to counter this feeling of perfectionism when I'm writing is I actually write garbage on purpose. So if I have a really cool idea for a short story or a poem or whatever, I give myself permission for the first draft to be shit. Typically my first draft is just a rundown of what happens in the story, as if I'm explaining it to a friend who doesn't really care. But I do include as many details as I can. I talk about the atmosphere and the mood, the emotions, but it's as if I'm just explaining it to myself. I'll write something down like the main character walks into this room and she is sad and she's staring at herself in the mirror and the lights are low. But that's obviously not what I would want to read. I'm just writing it in a way that when I look back on it, it's like notes. And getting something on the page is what's most important. Because the reality is that your first, your second, maybe even your fifth draft won't be good enough. And you have to learn to accept that. Writing out the whole story as a first draft, even if it's complete trash, makes me feel so good. It takes the idea out of my head and it puts it on the page, and it makes it something real, and it makes it something I can shape and mold, because you can't edit nothing. And I promise you, none of the authors you've ever read wrote their final draft the first time. So get used to writing garbage. Get used to writing badly, and get used to getting your ideas on the page before you do anything with it. Okay, so what do you do if you don't know what to write? This used to happen to me a lot. Some people like to use writing prompts, and you can find them all over the internet, but me personally, not so much. I actually have a few techniques of my own to get over this kind of block. So the first thing I like to do, and the thing I probably do the most, is this thing I call a brain dump. So when I sit down on my computer, and if I don't have an idea of exactly what I want to write down that day, I actually just start writing anything in my brain. It's just a complete taking everything out of here and putting it on the page, even if it makes no sense. I'll just write anything that comes to mind. If I have an observation of the room around me, if I notice anything, if I'm feeling anything, I will write that down. Kind of like a fluid train of thought. I don't really think about what's coming out, I just think about my fingers moving. And usually what ends up happening actually is I kind of latch onto an idea, and I'm able to kind of go with it and create a little story out of it. Usually in these kind of moments, it falls into what I said earlier about the first draft. This kind of writing for me is permission to make mistakes and to write nothing. And actually, in a way, it's the most enjoyable part about writing. It's writing with no expectations or no inhibitions. I don't expect anything out of a brain dump, but I know it's going to help me push my ideas out and get into the feeling and the flow of writing. And sometimes as I'm writing this brain dump, it'll start morphing into an idea that I had for a short story, or it'll morph into its own thing. And that's fine. I just kind of let it happen as it goes. A lot of the time my whole writing session ends up being one of these brain dumps, but I never delete them. The reason why is that sometimes I'll say a line that I really like and that I can use somewhere else, or who knows, maybe I'll come up with an idea. I have a separate category for the brain dumps, and I keep them all in one file, and every month or so I go back and I read over them and I look at whether or not anything is usable, anything can be translated into a story, and then I start an editing process if that's the case. And if not, that's fine. It's just there for practice. It's there to be the most free version of my writing. I also have another technique that I like to use specifically for poetry. I think it's really helpful because I don't always want to write short stories. Sometimes I just want to write something that's a little bit more focused or themed. So what I do for this exercise is that I build a little restriction for myself. I choose a subject, and then I write a list of the first 20 words that come to mind when I think about that subject. They could be emotions or qualities of the subject, it doesn't really matter. But then I task myself with writing a poem specifically around those 20 words. And I can either mention the subject or not. It can go in any kind of way, but the idea is that you have to use all 20 words. And sometimes this comes out pretty good and sometimes it comes out like trash, but the point is the creation. Like I said, the idea of getting something on the page is more important than what's on the page the first time. I can go back and edit the ones that have potential, and the ones that don't can probably be inspiration for something else later down the line. And usually when I do that exercise, I try to structure the poem into stanzas. And then as an addition to the exercise, I take that structured poem and its stanzas and I turn it into a prose poem. Now, personally, a lot of my poetry is very free form and free verse. I don't really use too much structure in my poetry, but I think it's really important to go back and look at poetic structure and figure out how words go together and how poetry really uses rhythm to its advantage. And that same information really does apply to short stories and prose and any other writing. A lot of the times you don't notice the structure of writing because it just feels really good to read. But the reason it feels really good to read is because people have thought about this. People put in the effort to figure out the rhythm and the fluidity of their words. And I really don't think the first draft needs to have any kind of structure other than getting the idea on the page. But once you get past that point, you can really use these things to your advantage. You can use poetic structure and rhythm to really shape the emotions in your story, or in your prose, or in your poetry. They're really useful tools, and I think it's a great idea to get familiar with them. Another thing I like to do specifically with poetry is after I write a poem, I'll try to write that same poem in 3 or 4 different ways. Maybe from a new perspective or a different underlying tone. Maybe I'm happy in this one, maybe it's upsetting in this one. Or maybe I'll just write the whole thing ass backwards. The underlying point with writing prompts or my techniques in general are trying to figure out how to do something in a different way than what you would normally do. One of my favorite things on the internet is that thing where people explain movies poorly. I think these things are brilliant, and I think this is exactly what you should be doing when you're trying to write and you're trying to be more creative in your writing. Thinking about new ways to describe things or identify things is essentially a writing exercise. And a few of my writing sessions have literally amounted to me just sitting down and describing different objects I see in the strangest ways I possibly can. Blank pages can be very intimidating, and whatever you need to do to get something on the page so that it's less intimidating is going to help. Whether it's writing junk or even just smashing on your keyboard for no reason. Sometimes just seeing something on the page, whether it makes sense or not, is going to help. And just give yourself permission to try something new, try something different, no matter how bad it is. Remember, nobody has to see this first draft. This is really just practice. This is something that you can file away and look at it later and maybe get something inspirational from. So to sum it all up, you need to give yourself a routine. Get into the habit of writing as often as you can for the same amount of time, and find the right trigger to make that habit stick. If you're stuck with perfectionism, get used to writing your ideas badly on purpose. Get something on the page no matter what it is. Do brain dumps and observations and anything at all. Nothing has to be good. It just has to be something on the page that you can work with later or use as inspiration. And once you have the words on the page, even if they're bad, you can work with them and make them something better. You can refine your work over and over again. Because really, writing is rewriting. Nothing really comes out right the first time, or maybe even the third time, but you need a starting point. Something that'll eventually look like the idea that you had in your head. And you had to start somewhere. Try to give yourself limitations. Don't be afraid to mix and match topics and formats. If you don't normally write poetry, try to write a poem. Make a list of topics and make a list of emotions, throw them in a hat, and then pick out 2. Find a site with writing prompts. There's so many of them. The bottom line is just to get words on a page that you can work with. Learn about forms and rhythm in poetry. Read a lot. Read things you're not used to. If you don't normally read fiction, read fiction. Read manga, read comic books, read newspapers, read a script for your favorite movie. The more you read and the more input you have, the more varied your exposure is to different writing styles and ways of expressing yourself. Carry around a notebook or just get used to writing notes in your phone of little things that inspire you, little dialogue lines that you think of. It doesn't have to be attached to anything you already have, but it could be something you use later. And honestly, I think the most important one is giving yourself permission to be bad. It's okay to write garbage. That's the point of practice. If you get used to writing stuff you don't like regularly, then eventually down the line you'll have a mountain of stuff to improve. And it's going to be way easier to improve something down the line if you've had that practice. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Also, I'm writing another poetry book I'm planning to release later this year. I did one about 5 years ago called Bunny and Bear. It's got some really awesome watercolor illustrations by a friend of mine named Carol, and I actually have a few copies of this left, so if you want to pick one up for $10 plus shipping, just send me a message on Instagram. I'll leave a link down in the description. Thanks for watching, friends. See ya.